They were never meant to be a list for sermons. They were meant to be a warning for survival. Somewhere in the silence of the early deserts of Egypt, long before cathedrals, before stained glass, before the word sin carried theatrical weight, a handful of monks began noticing something terrifying. Not demons outside, not enemies at the gate, but patterns inside their own minds, repeating, corrosive, predictable. They wrote them down like symptoms of a hidden disease. What we now call the 7 deadly sins did not begin as moral rules. They began as a psychological map of how human beings destroy themselves and others from within. And over centuries, that map was softened, preached, sanitized, turned into metaphors. But originally, these were observations from men who watched their own thoughts with the same intensity a hunter watches tracks in the sand. They were documenting how empires fall, how murders happen, how betrayals begin, long before a blade is drawn. The first list did not even have 7. In the 4th century, a monk named Evagrius Ponticus, living in the Egyptian desert, wrote of 8 evil thoughts that plagued him and other ascetics: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, vainglory, and pride. He wasn't talking about theology. He was describing mental states that made men irrational, obsessive, dangerous. He noticed that once a thought took root, it didn't stay private. It demanded action. Centuries later, Pope Gregory thus rearranged the list. He merged some, renamed others, and reduced them to 7. By the time Thomas Aquinas systematized them in the 13th century, they had become pillars of Christian morality. But something subtle had happened. They stopped being seen as internal mechanisms of collapse and started being seen as external crimes to avoid. The danger was no longer understood as psychological inevitability. It was framed as disobedience. And that shift hid their true power, because these sins are not acts. They are engines. Pride is always placed first, not because it is loud, but because it is silent. Pride is the belief that you are correct even when you are wrong, that you deserve more than others, that you are beyond correction. This is not arrogance. This is insulation from reality. Every historical catastrophe begins here. Kings who ignored warnings, generals who dismissed advisors, leaders who believed themselves chosen, infallible, untouchable. Pride doesn't scream. It closes ears, and once ears close, the rest follow. Envy comes next, a quieter poison. It does not want what you have. It wants you to not have it. That distinction has fueled more betrayals than ambition ever did. Cain did not want Abel's sheep. He wanted Abel erased. Envy has started revolutions, court conspiracies, assassinations within royal families. Because envy convinces a person that someone else's existence is an injustice. And when existence feels unjust, violence feels corrective. Then comes wrath, often portrayed as explosive rage. But historically, wrath is colder, calculated, sustained. Wrath is what allowed emperors to order massacres without trembling, what allowed inquisitors to torture calmly, what allowed soldiers to burn cities because they believed they were right. Wrath is moral anger that feels justified. It is the sin that convinces you that cruelty is a form of justice. Greed follows, not simple desire for wealth, but the inability to stop acquiring. Roman governors who starved provinces through taxation, colonial companies that drained continents, nobles who hoarded grain while peasants starved outside castle walls. Greed does not seek comfort. It seeks control. And control always requires someone else to have less. Then lust, often reduced to sexuality, but originally understood as obsessive desire that overrides judgment. Kings risking kingdoms for lovers, generals abandoning campaigns, religious leaders destroying institutions for secret affairs. Lust is the sin that blinds the future. It replaces long-term survival with immediate gratification. It rewrites priorities in real time. Gluttony is misunderstood too. It is not overeating. It is overconsumption without awareness of cost. Feasts during famine, luxury during collapse, indulgence while systems rot. Gluttony is the sin of people who believe resources are endless. And then sloth, the most misinterpreted of all. Not laziness, but moral apathy, the refusal to act when action is needed. Sloth is the reason genocides happen slowly, why neighbors stay silent, why atrocities proceed without resistance. Sloth is not doing nothing. It is choosing comfort over responsibility. Together, these were not spiritual warnings. They were a blueprint of how societies unravel. Look at Rome before it fell. Pride in invincibility, greed in taxation, gluttony in excess, lust in court scandals, envy in succession plots, wrath in brutal suppression, sloth in administrative decay. The monks were not predicting hell. They were describing history, And yet, over time, the narrative changed. The sins became personal failings rather than systemic forces. They became confessional items rather than analytical tools. But their pattern never disappeared. The Black Death spread faster because of gluttony and sloth insanitation. Witch hunts ignited from envy and wrath. Colonial exploitation thrived on greed and pride. World wars were fueled by national pride, envy of power, wrath disguised as patriotism. These sins don't disappear with civilization. They scale with it. That is why they are dangerous. They are not outdated religious ideas. They are recurring human algorithms. What makes them truly terrifying is how they disguise themselves as virtues. Pride calls itself confidence. Envy calls itself ambition. Wrath calls itself righteousness. Greed calls itself success. Lust calls itself passion. Gluttony calls itself lifestyle. Sloth calls itself peace. And because they wear masks, people defend them. History rarely records the moment someone said, "I am acting out of sin." Instead, it records statements like, "I deserve this." They deserve punishment. This is necessary. This is progress. The language changes. The mechanism stays. Evagrius understood something we forgot. These thoughts arrive quietly. They feel reasonable. They feel justified. And once accepted, they begin rearranging behavior without the person noticing. That is why ancient monks feared them in silence more than they feared armies. Because once these states settle in a mind, no external enemy is needed. Families fracture, communities rot, nations implode, not from attack, but from internal decay that feels logical at every step. And the most unsettling part? You cannot remove them. They are not diseases to cure. They are tendencies to monitor. They live in every human mind, waiting for moments of stress, power, fear, or opportunity. The early monks didn't preach about them loudly. They whispered about them privately, like men sharing knowledge of a predator that hunts at night. They knew something that later theology obscured. The danger is not punishment after death. The danger is what happens while you are alive. Because every atrocity in history can be traced back, step by step, to one or more of these forces operating unchecked. Not monsters, not demons, ordinary people, following thoughts that felt justified. And perhaps that is why this list survived for over 1,600 years. Not because it belonged in churches, but because it belonged in minds. A manual for recognizing the moment you begin to rationalize harm. The moment comfort becomes apathy. The moment desire becomes obsession. The moment confidence becomes delusion. The 7 deadly sins were never meant to shame. They were meant to warn, to ask a single unsettling question again and again. At what point does a thought stop being harmless and start becoming history? And how many times, across centuries, did people feel perfectly reasonable, right before everything